Hello and welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular episode of the stream program. Thank you for all of those viewers and listeners who provided some feedback to the other chats. It's been fantastic. Keep the feedback coming through. I find that useful, and also welcome any recommendations for future interviewees as we go into 2025. My guest today has an extensive CB in dealing with matters related to foreign affairs. Geoff Raby is a former Australian diplomat. He was stationed in China for a significant amount of time, and he has written rather recently a book called Great Game On, which examines the kinds of relationships that people are looking at in terms of the great powers and whether they are ganging up on the West or whether the West is misunderstanding what is going on. And that's actually a topic worth contemplating, because sometimes we need to take a step back and look at not simply what we think might be happening based on our own prejudices, but also what might actually be going on. Once we understand that, we can plan and think about things more strategically. Geoff, thanks for joining me for this particular discussion.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
Now, look, your book has a subtitle which opens the topic for us. It talks about, refers to the contest for Central Asia and global supremacy. Can we start there? Can you unpack the subtitle for us?
Yeah, certainly, Tom. In many ways, this follows on from my previous book, published in 2020, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New World Order. That book was framed by what I described as the great power shift of our time, and that was a power shift across the Pacific from the United States to China. And we've seen over the last 30 years with China's inexorable economic growth, similar expansion of China's military and political weight in the East Asian region and the Asia Pacific more generally. And this book very much is a sequel to that, insofar as it looks at what I describe as the second great power shift of our time, and that is across the Eurasian continent from Russia to China. And I should perhaps just define the area we're talking about. The book defines Eurasia as that vast stretch of territory from the Vistula River in Poland east to the Sea of Japan. Within that are two sub-areas that are of great relevance. One is what we know as Central Asia. They're the five stands: Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. And there is another concept which is core Eurasia, and that very much is the focus of the book. And to the five Central Asian stands, we add Afghanistan and Mongolia, and that really is the central area, I think, of the contest between China and Russia.
One of the interesting issues that comes up between, in the midst of all this, is of course the contest between those two. But if I look at some of the commentary about things that are going on in the Ukraine and elsewhere, you've got people who are looking at China and Russia and seeing them as convenient bedfellows. How do you, as a former diplomat, view that particular relationship? Is there something to what people are saying, or are they misreading the play?
Yes. So that goes, I think, into many ways to the core of the whole book. And that is the question of what is the future stability of the relationship between Russia and China, and is this a solid alliance against the West, or is it more, as I describe it, a concert of convenience? And why I argue that it's more of a concert of convenience is that in key geostrategic areas and geopolitical areas, their interests diverge rather than converge. I say that there's more that divides them than unites them. So there's a very long history of conflict and disputation. That arises partly from their fundamental difference in how they achieve their security. Russia, as you see with Ukraine, believes it needs to occupy neighboring territories, have buffer zones in order to protect its core areas. China, on the other hand, looks to have client states or tributary states, states that are free to basically operate. They're not colonies, free to operate in their own way, but are required by China to recognize the legitimacy and authority of Beijing and the powers in Beijing. Historically, the tributary idea is fascinating when you dig into it, because when the emissaries from places like Vietnam, for example, the neighboring countries, Korea, whatever, would come to the court in Beijing and present gifts to the emperor, they often went home with gifts of far greater value than that which they took to the court. The point being, for the emperor, who didn't need anything, it would be a humiliation if it looked as if he was wanting to transfer resources from a lesser state, was the act of recognizing the emperor's supreme authority. And that was important for the emperor to maintain his authority within China rather than over the neighboring states. So two very fundamental differences, approaches to how they achieve security, which inevitably brings them into conflict. What's happened, if you look at it historically, is that this vast area that we're talking about had previously been under Qing control, and then that was settled by a treaty called the Treaty of Ajun in 1689. And that represented a period that lasted for 200 years where the Qing were relatively more powerful than the Russians. But come the mid-19th century, when the European powers are nibbling away at the coastal territories of China and occupying territory up and down China's coast, and the Qing court was on the verge of collapse and was very, very weak and internal looking, the Russians demanded two treaties from the Qing. One, the Treaty of Tianjin, 1858, another, the Convention of Peking, 1860. And with those two treaties, vast areas of territory, over 1 million square kilometers of territory, went to Russia. And today, not 1 kilometer of that has been returned. And just to help your listeners put this in perspective, that territory is equivalent to 1/7 of the entire continent of Australia, which is still held by Russia. And Russia was able to do that because power shifted between the two. And it's important to understand that what we're living through now is another power shift, but this time back towards China. And that's why I think ultimately the long-term relationship between the two is inherently unstable.
It's actually, it gives us reason to pause to reflect on the approach that is being taken by, say, Russia to the Ukraine, for example, where it wants what it sees as historical territory. And on the other hand, you've just articulated in a very, very pithily in a short burst, the history of, the tension between Russia and China in terms of, basically land grab by agreement. If I'm putting that correctly.
Well, not quite agreement. These 19th century treaties, the Chinese have always referred to as unequal treaties, because they're made in the context of unequal power balance. And of the Europeans, which have always been attacked and criticized by China, particularly under the Communist Party, for the unequal treaties, all of the Europeans have returned the territory. Only Russia has never returned any territory acquired under these unequal treaties. So it comes back always to this question of the balance of power. And that's why I take a different view on the outlook of the China-Russia relationship than, say, many contemporary commentators. They see things like in February 22, Putin goes to Beijing just before the Winter Olympics, and a statement comes out describing the relationship as a friendship without limits. And immediately everyone in the West rushed off and said they're ganging up on us, and this is an alliance of autocrats, an axis of authoritarian states, you name it. But what's interesting is ever since that statement was made, you've never heard it again in Chinese media, in Chinese propaganda, because it denies the difference in interests that underlies that relationship. What they do share, absolutely, is a sour, even bitter attitude towards the West, and particularly the US. They're not bound together by common interests, by common security, by ideology. They're bound only by a dislike of the US-led West. And the other important point here that needs to be borne in mind is Russia and China are integrated into the international system in vastly different ways. Russia is not much more than a hydrocarbon exporter, oil and gas. China, however, is, as we all know, through complicated supply chains, it is utterly dependent on world markets for all its energy and resources it needs to keep the economy going. Its financial system, everything is much, much more deeply integrated into the West and actually more exposed to Western pressure. Russia is very, very different. So a sour attitude towards the West can change overnight, if you like.
It strikes me there's another question that's worth exploring here, given the fact that you've raised some of the problems you've got with contemporary commentators on the China-Russia relationship. How do we get a more sophisticated understanding out there in the community about how these countries operate? Is the actual consequence of the commentary, or rather, is the commentary that we're seeing the product of the political machinations here rather than the clear thinking on the part of analysts?
Oh, I think very much the former, Tom. I mean, look, one of my motivations for writing the book, I have to say, it turned out to be harder than I had imagined, because the whole history and the geopolitics is so complicated. And I've tried really hard to simplify it for people, because I believe it's such an important part of the world and bears so directly on global stability that it really does need to be understood better than what it is in commentary that we see through the papers or think tanks. Look, there's another element to this. I mean, we hear heads of our intelligence agencies, be it here or in London or Washington, talking about the alliance of disruptors, China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, never looking at what divides them, what their different interests are, never looking really at how effective they would be in operating together, and asserting and basically assuming that this is a given. And I'm disturbed at how many journalists just repeat these lines as a given. Frankly, many of the people in the intelligence agencies or the military have a vested interest in beating up this threat. It's just like the China threat. And if I go back to my book, the second chapter you may have read on the Great Game in the 19th century, where Imperial Russia under the Tsars was said by British analysts, the media, popular journalists, politicians to have an intent to take India from Britain, to take over British India, where there never was in the court of St. Petersburg any idea, and anyone who's travelled, any idea to do so, and anyone who's travelled, as I have, around the vertiginous mountain passes of the high Himalaya will know how fanciful that is. And even Lord Salisbury in the 1880s, who was what they called a forwarder, someone who was beating the Russia threat drum and saying Britain had to be more present and engaged in Central Asia to block Russia. He even once in Parliament had to say, if the honourable gentleman looked at the map and used a ruler rather than inches, they wouldn't be so worried. I mean, geography prevails in many ways. So, I mean, you get my point. And so it's easy for people who have interests, whether it's to get budgetary allocation, whether it's to get, build military strength, easy for these people to talk up these threats. And there's very little critical analysis that tries to pull the assertions apart and really try and understand them in the geopolitical, historical, and economic context, as I've tried to do in this book.
You make a point in the answer that there's little critical analysis. Is that because you've got journalists in the press gallery in Canberra and elsewhere who are captive to their sources, shall we say, that sit in a particular part of either the intelligence and security establishment or within government more generally, who are wanting to seed a narrative out there about China or Russia that suits a political motivation rather than serve the audience that journalists and commentators ought to be serving, to provide them with a clearer view of why things are the way they are.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. That's a big part of the issue, and the bubble's not just in Canberra and between certain media in Canberra and or representatives, certain media and the bureaucratic interests, but it's also between our bureaucratic and security military interests and the United States bureaucratic, strategic and military security and military interests. Look, given how much it's at stake with the military-industrial complex, how much money is being spent against these threats or to protect us against these threats, we really do need to have clinical, dispassionate analysis of every statement, of every argument. But what do we get? Was it earlier this year, I think, the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald with red arrows coming from China, showing China attacking Australia. And it was based on a seminar that involved 3 analysts from ASPI, who have always been known as China hawks. There wasn't a dissenting contrary view permitted in that discussion. And the Sydney Morning Herald ran it for 3 days. That is not critical, clinical, calm, dispassionate analysis. And what we're talking about is billions of dollars and the potential of war and massive loss of life. We owe it to ourselves to tease all of these threads out and have a proper public discussion about them.
Having made that observation, how do we have a proper public discussion about them?
Well, you're contributing now. I've contributed with my books, and I write the occasional column these days still for the Australian Financial Review. We have a lot of organs. I've done, for promoting this book, I've done a lot of podcasts. I've spoken in many forums. I've got a full program in the first quarter of next year to do so as well. There is the opportunity, but clearly it's not a level playing field whatsoever. But the good thing is we do live in a democracy where we can say these things. It's not like China or Russia, where contrarian, dissenting views can be heard in public. So we're in a pretty good shape. I think one of the things I've always said in the context of the China threat and particularly Chinese interference in the domestic politics in Australia, is that our domestic institutions are very strong. The parliament's very strong. The media is very strong. Even if you disagree or don't like some of the bias that's in the media, it's still very strong. And ultimately, it's open to challenge as well. And in many ways, it's more challengeable now because although we have incredible media concentration in Australia, almost to an undemocratic extent, we have these podcasts, we have new media to have this sort of discussion in, and more people are going to these sources.
One of the things I would like to explore before we conclude, and you've been very generous with your time, there are a range of issues that need to be managed in any context, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be looking at both. How does somebody in the line of work that you used to be, and that is being a diplomat and an ambassador, balance all of this and reflect on all of that, and to give it context to people sitting in Canberra who are no doubt besieged by journalists, besieged by their own political colleagues and their opponents on a raft of issues? How do you manage that to try and keep it level-headed and cool-headed in terms of the analysis that's provided to people so they make sensible decisions?
When you're asking that, Tom, I'm smiling. I'm thinking of a famous quote from Sir Harold Macmillan, the former British Foreign Secretary, when asked a similar question. He said to the interviewer, "Events, my dear boy, events." And that is the reality of foreign policy. Stuff happens all the time, events. And, what I think is important in this context is that the advisors are deeply committed to having a very strong grasp of history, of geography, of economics, that they have the intellectual framework. So when the events happen, they're able to quickly place them in a context. And one of the key things as a senior civil servant, senior ambassador, policy advisor to government was always to be able to help ministers understand where this comes from, what it means, and what we might do about it. And for that, you need really a lot of context and background. I have to say, some of the foreign ministers I worked closely with over the best part of a 30-year career that I thought did the job extremely well were those who are most interested in reading history, political biography, and who'd love to debate these sorts of issues. So they were alive and they were on their minds all the time. So when the events happened, they had context.
Is that one of the reasons why some of the commentariat is weak? Because there may not always be a depth of understanding of the subject matter when they come to deal with a particular event that happens in a particular circumstance. There's a political environment that is volatile, that is brittle, and an event blows up. Is there something to be said for even news organisations ensuring they have people with a greater depth of training or greater depth of study looking at this?
Oh, absolutely. On that, I could not agree more. And I think some of the better media around the world, New York Times, for example, Financial Times in particular, always have a core of op-ed writers who have great depth and knowledge of the subjects that they're writing about. I think the Financial Review in Australia has done this very well with the appointment of James Curran as the international editor. His pieces are of a quality and a standard above almost anything else that's written on foreign policy in Australia, because he's been a professional analyst, historian, professor at university, and so he has the context, he has the background to be able to comment authoritatively instead of just making wild assertions, which so much of the media does.
Where, given the circumstances in the world today, that's a broad sweeping statement because there's plenty of them, but how do you see things right now, given all that's going on that we observe daily, whether it be on the news, whether it be in the print papers or even online? What are the things that concern you most about the contemporary world?
Well, again, my emphasis on context, I guess. What we're seeing is something I talked about in my last book 4 years ago. This is the new multipolar world order. The old order of dominant single power of the United States, it's gone, it's finished. 4 years ago, when I wrote those words that it was already over, it seemed risque, it seemed out there. Now, most people accept that we live in a multipolar world, and this is the reality of a multipolar world. And what can demonstrate that more? The US's capacity to influence the Western Front in the Ukraine conflict in Europe is constrained. It's had minimal impact, it would seem, in Israel, Palestine, the Middle East. Syria implodes without either of the big powers being involved, but we discover that a key actor in all of this is Turkey. This is what a multipolar order looks like, and it is chaotic. What we need to do is think about how we bring order into such an international order. And that's, again, where I would draw a big contrast between Russia, which is a revisionist power intent on smashing any notion of order, compared with China, which is systematically building its own order around itself. And I see a world in which we have two bounded orders, one around the United States, aligned through values and common political systems and so on, and one around China for the same sorts of reasons. And if nothing doesn't demonstrate that to me more, was the BRICS summit in Kazan last month, where 23 heads of state turned up at Putin's invitation, even though Putin is so heavily sanctioned by the West. And another 40 states have indicated they would like to join the BRICS. This is a China construct. It's China created, China led, China funded, but it's a multipolar world. And so you have Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, all wanting to become members of the BRICS, but finding no contradiction in that with being long-standing members of ASEAN. This is the complexity of the world we live in. We just have to get to understand that. And the simplicities and the certainties and the predictability of the old order have gone. And the last section of my last book, I called Australia's dystopian future, trying to explain that this is the sort of world Australia is going to have to learn to live in, one that doesn't have the same comfort levels and certainties of the old US-led order for Australia.
One way of summarising that is that in the past, people seem to have a simplistic narrative. The story becomes more complicated, and you've got to try and explain that in a different way. It's not simply a story of goodies and baddies anymore, is it?
Very well said, Tom. Exactly. We're not in a goodies and baddies, black and white world. It's all shades of grey. It's very complex.
Yep. Geoff, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate the insight and the background you bring to this discussion. I hope you tour across the first quarter of 2025 goes well.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. All the best for the festive season to you as well.
Thank you. I've been talking to Geoff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China and also a long-standing public servant. about the challenges in the big wide world, and also whether we actually understand China and Russia and how they cooperate or not cooperate with each other, as the case may be. Thank you for watching, and there'll be another episode of Ravlic at Large reasonably soon. Stick around.